Um, Hello, everybody. First of all, I suppose this is the moment at which I suggest that you turn your mobile phones and other devices to silent, please. I would suggest that you turn them off, but I think that will discourage a lot of enthusiastic tweeting, probably, and we wouldn't want to do that. So, while you're doing that, good evening and welcome. My name's David Colclough. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of English here at Queen Mary. And welcome to this annual English lecture. It's an enormous honour to have as our speaker tonight Professor Franco Moretti from Stanford University. It always begins with a personal anecdote. I think I first became aware of Professor Moretti's work about 25 years ago when I was an infant, an undergraduate, and a friend of mine suggested rather vigorously that I should read a book called Signs Taken for Wonders. Being quite biddable and also liking the sound of the title, I did so. And I have to say that that book had a very profound and lasting effect on me. I remember in particular being quite inspired by the second chapter of the book called The Great Eclipse, which, to summarize rather brutally, argued that Elizabethan and Jacobean tragic drama effectively created the conditions which made possible the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Now, I know for a fact that I'm not alone, and I'm not going to simply hark back to ancient history, but I'm not alone in having been inspired by Signs Taken for Wonders, and conversations with various colleagues over the past few weeks have made this abundantly clear. But while many scholars can influence a single generation of readers with an important book, far rarer, I think, is the scholar who can continue to influence successive generations of scholars with equally innovative and groundbreaking works. In Professor Moretti's case, it's almost, I think, as though his work in the academy effects the sort of paradigm shifts that he describes taking place in literary history. Most recently, in a series of books and also in the Stanford Literary Lab, which he established, Professor Moretti has gone so far as to effectively think of how to reinvent what it is that we call literary history. Taking approaches from quantitative graphs, geographical mapping and evolutionary theory, applying the methods of computational criticism to literary texts and artifacts, he's shown that what he's called distant reading is a way of seeing things afresh, reconceptualizing what we formerly talked about as the canon and expanding what we might do with that. It effectively, therefore, I think, addresses some of our most fundamental assumptions about what it is that we do when we do the kind of work that we do. It's only one of the many fruits that this kind of work has yielded, and that means that my colleague Ruth Arnott can't be here tonight because she's in Stanford working on the application of network theory to Tudor letters. But I'm very glad to say that another colleague who's been instrumental in arranging Professor Moretti's visit, Matt Ingleby, will be moderating the questions that he so kindly agreed to take at the end of his lecture. Now, Matt's a Victorianist, and so that's the other aspect of Professor Moretti's work that I want to talk about, and partly because it speaks also to the department here at Queen Mary, a department that's growing its undergraduate provision of Victorian studies, that's established a new MA programme in that field as well, because we are therefore very lucky to have with us somebody who's done so much in recent years to reinvigorate study of this crucially important historical period, from Professor Moretti's incredibly important work on the Bildungsroman, going back again a few years, to his Encyclopedia of the Novel, 1800 to 1900, and more recently than that, his work on the bourgeois. Now, at the opening of his book, Graphs, Maps, Trees, Professor Moretti spoke of the combination of humility and euphoria that his investigations there might generate, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in feeling a great deal of humility being in the presence of such a great scholar today, or indeed sharing as much euphoria as we all do in hearing him speak. Professor Moretti's title, as you can see, is Canon Archive. I don't know how to represent a slash. So, Canon Archive, Large-Scale Dynamics in the Literary Field. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here. This is a typical product of the kind of work we do in this little research group at Stanford that we call, with a little exaggeration, the Literary Lab. It's a group of, most of our work is collective. And Mark Algie Hewitt is a colleague. He's been at Stanford now for 2 years. He's a junior professor. Sarah Allison was a grad student at Stanford and now teaches in New Orleans. Marisa Gemma was a grad student at Stanford and now has a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. Ryan Heuser and Hannah Walzer are still graduate students there. This is a typical combination, and we can get, I will not address the issue of group work directly. It's certainly been one of the major novelties for me of this kind of work. But today I want to talk about, this new possibilities that digitization has opened for us, and many novelties. Perhaps the single biggest one is the size of the archive. Victorianists used to work on, say, 200 19th century novels. Nowadays we can work, although differently, on 2,000, tomorrow 20,000, in a short while maybe 200,000. Going outside of Britain or moving into different periods. So it's a moment of great, indeed, euphoria for people who are interested in quantitative literary history. It's also the moment of truth. Sure, we've been given these telescopes, these new tools that allow you to see entire new galaxies, thousands of books no one had read. Have these new digital skies revealed anything that changes our view of literature? This is the question. Do digital humanities make a difference? They're doing things no one was doing before. Sure. Does that change what literature departments, students, professors? And this is not a rhetorical question, and my answer will not be yes after a couple of twists and turns. It will be much more problematic. It's not a rhetorical question because for me, the inspiration towards quantitative history was a famous essay by Fernand Braudel, a French historian, 1958. It's called History and the Social Sciences, the long duration. And it's the essay in which Braudel salutes the advent of a new quantitative history that will break with the traditional form of 19th century history. And in sort of describing this event, he also described the typical materials of this new history. He said, well, this new history will deal with demographic progressions, the movement of wages, variations in interest rates, productivity, money supply and demand, and so on. And as you can see, these are all quantifiable entities, clearly enough, but they are also completely new objects compared to what traditional history used to do, which was the history of legislation, military campaigns, political cabinets, diplomacy, elections, and so on and so on. So it was the double shift that changed the practice of history. This was a great revolution in historiographical thinking, the French school of the Annales in the 50s and 60s. But it was this double shift, new materials and quantification, not quantification alone. In our case, where are the new materials? We used to study 200 novels, now we can study 200,000. But they're all still novels. So where is the novelty? Well, 199,000 novels no one has ever studied. This is a typical answer. How could there not be novelties? Of course, one sees the point. It's a whole new dimension of literary history. We know more about people exchanging goods for reasons of prestige than about the kinds of exchanges that go on every day. This is French anthropologist André Leroy-Gourhan in a book called Gesture and Speech. belongs to the same atmosphere as Brodel's essay. We know more about the circulation of dowry money than about the selling of vegetables. And dowry and vegetables, it's a perfect antithesis, right? Because they're both very important things, but for completely opposite reasons. Dowry because it happens once in a lifetime. Vegetables because they happen every day. And at first, it looks like it's possible to just take the antithesis and move it into the literary field. But as soon as you start pressing, it gets a little more complicated. It looks like dowry stands for the 200 novels and vegetables for the 200,000. But take two novels, two historical novels, published in the same year, 1814. One, predictably, is Waverley, and the other one is Sir Ferdinand of England by a certain James Brewer. And intuitively, you would associate Waverley with the prestige of the dowry, and Sir Ferdinand of England with the much humbler role of vegetables. But in fact, Scott's novel was both a great formal breakthrough, a great prestigious breakthrough, and the book everybody was reading all over England and all over Europe in a few months. So it was, so to speak, dowry and you want vegetables? Well, Waverley were the vegetables of the time. But if that is the case, then what will all the Sir Ferdinands that we can now study in the digital archive add to our knowledge? We knew nothing about these things. Now we can know something. Knowledge is always good. Is it also knowledge that changes our paradigms? I want to illustrate this problem with a finding from our own research, which is the decline. This was work by two grad students. One was indeed Ryan Heuser, the other one Longley Cat. And they studied the decline of the semantic field of abstract values, and especially abstract moral values, words like modesty, decency, honor, etc., etc. See their frequency from the early 19th century to the end of the century. And as you can see, it's a very clear trend, and the title of their work was A Quantitative Literary History of 2,958. Now, when people are so punctilious about things, that means they wanted to make a point. This is something you can understand only if you study the new archive that is made possible by digitization. So, at the beginning of this project, I said, well, okay, let's take the 200 novels instead of the 3,000. Had you studied the old canon, would things have changed? The canon is blue, the archive is red, and as you can see, no. The trajectory is exactly the same. So this doesn't mean that studying the archive will tell us nothing. This does mean, however, that we still have to learn how to ask a certain type of question that the old canon did not allow us to ask. But first, before getting into that type of question, what do we mean with these two words, canon and archive? And how did we construct the study? I will try this when this will be published in a couple of months, and sorry, but it's very hot here, and it will have enormous footnotes describing, the very hard work that we did in trying to put together the canon. What do we mean by archive? We started with, as working propositions with three concepts: the published, the archive, and the published is all literature that becomes public. Novels that are published, plays that are played. Of course, there can be fuzzy borders, novels that are written but rejected by publishers, etc., etc., etc. But, basically we know what that is. Then there is the archive, which is that portion of the published which has been preserved, usually in libraries, and which is now increasingly digitized. And then there is the corpus, which is a large collection, but still it's a sub-portion of the archive. So that part of the archive that one decides to use for a specific project. In this case, in that case of those two students, 3,000 novels out of the 30 or 40,000 that were published in the 19th century. Now, the novelty of our times is that, especially for 19th and 20th century, the corpus can be almost as large as the archive, and the archive itself is getting to be almost as large as the published. And when I will speak of archive in the next 45 minutes, that's what I have in mind, the potential sort of convergence of these three Chinese dolls that otherwise would sit one inside the other. It's a sort of total history of literature, to borrow another expression from French historians. This is the theory. The practice turned out to be a very, very different story. Because, in the present project, for instance, we started and we realized that we had about, in our databases, about 30% of the novels published in England, in Britain, in the period between 1770 and 1830, which is a period which has excellent bibliographies prepared by Raven and Garside in this country, published by Oxford. So we know what novels have been published because of the work of these two scholars. Having about 30% of that, compared to the old canon, it's a lot of novels, but it's not necessarily a representative sample. And I will not go into the details. We decided to do a random sample, which is the scientifically appropriate way of dealing with these things. So the computer generates a sort of lottery, and all the thousands of novels gets a number, it selects it. We thought in a matter of weeks we would be able to work on these. There were about 600 novels. In fact, 6 months later, we were still basically stuck with the 30% that we initially had. For a combination, of bad digital editions that may be good but cost a lot of money, and we don't have that money, and digital editions that are good, cost a lot of money. The money has been paid for by Stanford in the past, by the libraries, not by us, but the table of contents of these collections is so crazy that you can't really, the novel is there, but there are 10,000 novels. How do you get it? How do you work with, and this is librarians. It's not a dilettante like myself. I don't do programming. This is the digital librarian, the curator of the digital libraries at Stanford. So in the end, and as I said, this is a long chapter of woe, we decided to simply work with a small Canon, to which I'll come in 1 second, and a non-random sample about 4 times as large as the canonical portion. And the result, this is not the way an experiment should be designed, but after 6 months we just wanted to do some work, and this seemed to be the only way. There is a famous scene in Brecht's Galilei in which Galilei says, "Oh, better to have dirty hands than empty." That's exactly my feeling. But I'm not proposing that you follow our example here, but it is difficult. The short lesson: there is a myth that everything is available and for free, and in the digital, in this new digital set, for free, certainly not, and available, not really, and when available, not necessarily reliable. You will see an example of that later on. So this for the archive. Canon's a different story. Initially we started with Canon about 250 novels for the 19th century. It was not designed by us. Some of you may know this. It's a Chadwick-Healy 19th century collection. It was done in the 90s by 2 scholars, completely unconstrained. They chose what they thought were the best novels, but not only that. For instance, they are the 6 Austen novels but they also have Lady Susan, which is a sort of early novel. They have, and so on. They have some elbow room. This seemed to be like a good proxy for the canon. Then, when you look more closely at the list, you'll start saying, is it really the best way of doing it? And then they update it all the time. So this Chadwick-Healy database was becoming less and less canonical because it was becoming larger. And so we grew uneasy about the idea, and then we realized that the concept of the canon, about which we all talk all the time, but which is seldom defined, one of the few things that can be said is certainly that it is many-sided and elusive. And relying on a single source for a concept like that was not, didn't seem to be a good idea. So we decided to keep the Chadwick-Healy somewhat on the horizon, but to also turn to two other sources, the Dictionary of National Biography, which 19th century novelists have made it into the Dictionary of National Biography, and the PMLA, the 20th century, the whole century of articles in PMLA, one of the standard mainstream publications, what novelists had been listed by PMLA in their digital as main subject of their article. Here again, these were not, neither the DNB nor the PMLA had been constructed by us, so they were, other scholars who had done it. The novelty was that not only these were public materials, but that they were explicitly declared and they were measurable. You could count how many words the entry on Jane Austen or on Maria Edgeworth had in the DNB, just as you could count the number of times Scott or Galsworthy, not Galsworthy, let's say Gissing, had appeared in the PMLA. So the criteria were still questionable, but they were multiple, explicit, and measurable. This was the novelty. The canon was not just a decision, was the confluence of several criteria. The DNB, the fact that the national culture, the DNB, may define the canon in a certain way. International scholarship, PMLA, may describe it in a slightly different way. The editors of Chadwick-Healy in a third different way. So this was the idea. This is a many-sided concept. Let's try to take it from many sides and find a way of having a composite measure. As we were working on this, we realized, okay, once you start quantifying this, there are other aspects of literary life that could be quantified. And I mentioned earlier these great bibliographies of the English novel by James Raven and Peter Garside. And in those two big volumes, they have explicitly provided information about all the reprints of English novels and all translations into French and German. These were two other measures that could be added to the DNB and the PMLA. And again, the criteria would be multiple, explicit, and measurable, but with a difference from the previous two, because reprints and translations and other similar metrics could be added. Reprints and translations measure. What do they measure? They measure the popularity of novels through institutions of the literary market. DNB and PM, and so the popularity of novels through the literary market for a general audience. DNB and PMLA measure the prestige of the same novels in the eyes of not of the general audience, but usually of academic readers. And again, other measures could be added. For instance, someone in France who's working on textbooks, school textbooks, which would be similar in that respect. So we found ourselves having two sets of measurements, DNB and PMLA measuring prestige reprints and translations measuring popularity. And once we realize that, see how these projects go, you want to do something. In order to do that something, you have to turn certain concepts into quantifiable entities. And it's never simple, it's never direct. These are not concepts that were coined in order to be transformed into quantifiable entities. So as you're doing that, you discover other possibilities if you're lucky. At times you just bang your head against the wall. In this case, at least in this part of the work, I think we were lucky. Once we realized that we had these two metrics, we realized that we were basically doing the same thing that perhaps the most famous chart of literary history of the past 50 years, or perhaps of all the history of literary criticism have done. So Pierre Bourdieu's chart of the French literary field, in the third quarter of the 19th century. Many of you may have seen this. This appears in various of his publications, and the standard, I think we took this from the Rules of Art, and he has two axes. This is just taken, reproduced from his edition. Basically, the vertical axis is the axis of prestige, from no prestige to high literary prestige. The horizontal axis is the axis of popularity, of market success, from poor to rich, in his words. And we had metrics that were really doing the same thing. And so we decided to project our metrics. By the way, look at this chart. There is something, I will show you other charts. None of them looks at all like this. And actually, not even Bourdieu's chart, when he's working as an empirical sociologist, look like this. This is way too regular and way too evenly occupied to be realistic as a chart. There is no objective metric whereby you can say that poetry should be there, the novel there, drama there, industrial art there, little reviews there, etc., etc. I'm not saying it's wrong. By and large, it's persuasive. But it's persuasive not in an empirical way, in a conceptual way. And pretends to be empirical, because usually these things are empirical. When you try to do, now I'm going to project our own data on the horizontal, we use the same thing. On the horizontal axis, success, popularity. On the vertical axis, prestige. And as you can see, things are very different. And here you can see how extreme the success of Walter Scott, it sort of dwarfs the entire field is. And actually, the measures here, we can go into details later, but at least I want to say this. We basically, these numbers, 2, 4, 6, etc., are the standard deviations above the mean for the two measures. So a standard deviation is a measure of deviation from the average. So Scott is like 20 times, 20 of these iterations above the average for the literary field around 1830 in terms of success, of popularity. And this actually understates his popularity, because at this time, novels were published in the first run of 750 to 1,000 copies, and his first three Waverley novels had opening runs of 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000. So it should be even farther, above. So this is, what the chart looks like. To make it more readable, we eliminated Scott. We eliminated the outliers. So you can see better what happens. And actually, Goethe and Austen will also disappear. We may return to Austen later. This is the second chart. And as you can see, it's these two lines that we have drawn. They they trisect the field. And this one here, the lower one, basically defines the region where popularity is twice as high as prestige. The other one defines the region in which prestige is twice as high as popularity. And in the middle, is the region in which the two balance each other. And so what emerged here was this basic tripartition of the literary field. Down here, the field of high popularity, as you can see, these are writers that are 5, 6, 7, 10 standard deviations above the mean from the field. So extremely popular in terms of reprints and translations. And who are you probably know some of them, you probably don't know several others. This I would call the space of genre. You find here, sentimental novels of the late 18th century, then the Gothic cohort, then national tales, Jacobin and anti-Jacobin novels, and then the new hegemonic form, which is the historical novel. It's a space of genre understood as a space of all genres. It's a space of formula fiction. Popularity and formula fiction already around 1800 form a single block. Those of you who've read Waverley may remember that the first chapter is entirely devoted to titles, and more precisely to genre signals embedded in titles. It's a great sign of the atmosphere, of an atmosphere where genre really dominates the literary market, and where publishers who specialize in one genre alone, Gothic novels, Silver Fork novels, etc., etc. In the middle, the balanced, so to speak, region, if one is ever justified in saying simply, well, here is the canon, well, here is the canon. I mean, look at that. Defoe, Sterne, Fielding, Richardson, Burney, Goldsmith, Godwin, and then someone else was there, one of those dots. These programs have this maddening way of eliminating names every now and then. But Smollett was also there, yeah, and now has fallen off. And all of them are clustered in this very balanced space, but 3 to 8 standard deviation above the mean in terms of popularity, 4 to 7 in terms of prestige. It's perfectly central position in which there is still all the pleasure of formula fiction, but also the recognition of high cultural institutions. And, seeing the canon in this kind of context, within these coordinates, well, makes you think about the process of canonization in a different way. It feels, okay, this is a transformation. All of these authors here, 60 years later, were probably much more popular. So popularity after the first few years can only shrink. It's inevitable. But, it depends how fast it shrinks. These are novelists who manage to survive from generation to generation, losing points, losing score, but preserving enough while they were gaining in prestige. So the canon appears as a sort of balancing act. It's no longer something which has features of its own. It's suspended between two much more solid realities, the market and the school, really. And few institutions in the modern world are as crucial for works of writing as the market and the school. And these are the books that can play on both tables. And perhaps it should be added, these are the books that could play on both tables, because there was a social class in the 19th century in Britain, but in other European countries. There was a social class that could join what German sociology has long called the bourgeoisie of property and the bourgeoisie of culture. The bourgeoisie has always had this double face. Property, the market, culture, the school. This balanced canon is the creature of that bourgeoisie. That bourgeoisie, but this is something on which I've just written a book, so I will not say, but let's say that bourgeoisie ended with World War I. That type of canon is probably, which is still to some extent the one about which we think is losing, in my opinion, its sociological underpinning. Finally, the third region, the region of high prestige and relatively little success. You can see Cervantes on top there. The other little dot is, I think, Shelley. Percy Shelley, which is enormously high in terms of prestige, but actually not at all in terms of success of the horizontal axis. And here in this region you find fundamentally two types of authors. Foreign authors, and when it comes to British ones, authors who wrote a novel, maybe even a few novels, but can't really be considered as novelists. So Samuel Johnson, there is Horace Walpole, there's poets like indeed Shelley or Moore and Hogg as you go down a little bit. There is a novelist politician like Disraeli, there is an essayist like Lamb. Again, at lower prestige levels, there are novelist playwrights, novelist musicians, novelist actors or actresses. Among the novelists, there is a strange, strong presence of politics. There is the radical politics of Mary Shelley and especially of the blue-stocking Sarah Scott, sort of feminist utopia, Millennium Hall. There is also the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, Hannah More, whose only novel, Zealots in Search of a Wife, legend has it that it was the only novel Queen Victoria entirely approved of. I leave it to you to imagine the type of novel. It is a little boring. And all right. Now, with this, it goes down, but I will stop here. As you can see, at this point, a first arch of our project had reached its conclusion, even though a student who's not part of this team is starting a follow-up study entirely on popularity and prestige. So basically what had happened was that we had moved away from the archive. These are almost all of them canonical authors. But our attempt to operationalize, as the jargon has it, operationalizing is the activity whereby you turn a concept into a series of operations that a computer can do. So we try to operationalize the concept of the canon, to turn it into quantifiable entities. Doing that made us see certain things about the canon through the results we found, which changed our idea. So as I said, this situation halfway between school and market sort of hollowed the concept of much of its interest. Having done this, the natural prosecution would be, okay, forget about the canon. Let's study the dynamic of the literary field. Let's multiply the metrics of popularity and prestige. Let's go down. You see, hundreds of novelists are all bunched in there because they have neither popularity nor prestige. How deep can we go? What can we find once we get into that big blob down? All right, and this, as I said, will have a follow-up soon. Tonight, I want to add another, I will go on for another, I could go on for a long time, but I will limit myself to about 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes. Because, see, I emphasize the difference between these charts and Bourdieu. For instance, Bourdieu there, when we have Fielding, Stern, Richardson, Defoe, you don't have those kind of figures. You have very crass playwrights of the Second Empire, Second Empire. So the equivalent of today's Hollywood blockbusters, or silly musicals. So he has really no room. His chart is completely different from ours, or ours from his. But on one point, they're identical. In order to make this, you don't need to open a single loop. These are all external metrics of different kinds, perhaps of different value, but all external metrics. But we wanted to open the novels. And specifically, we wanted to see if it was possible to find in the novels some morphological reasons for their social destiny. So, in a sense, we started the whole experiment. Again, this was the first part, the sociological part of the experiment. Then we started a morphological part of the experiment, and we restarted from scratch. Let's go back to Chadwick Healy, the 200 novels, and a sample of about, now we worked with a little over 1,000 novels. So in relationship of 1 to 4, 1 canonical novel to 4 archival novels. And let's see if we can figure out anything about what gave them these different fates. And the first step, we tried a million things, nothing worked. But then, one of us, Mark Algie Hewitt, this young colleague, realized that 2 years earlier, completely different study. This is one of the nice things where you reuse old pieces, all of a sudden you discover, it's bricolage. You discover that, oh, with this I can do something else. He had done a chart in which he had measured information and repetition in the 19th century corpus. And this is the chart. The canon is in blue and the archive is in red. And as you can see, on that measurement of his, he had measured it without any distinction between canon and archive. Then we said, okay, let's give them now different colors. We know what these novels are. It turned out to be an insanely powerful measurement of their difference. This is an abstract rendition of the previous chart. It's called box and whiskers plots, and the boxes are the 2 central quartiles. So it's 50, and the line is the median value. So as you can see, and then the whiskers are the extreme quartiles, and the dots are outliers. As you can see, about 80% of the archive in red is more repetitive or less informative, we use the two as synonymous, than 80% of the canon, which is incredible. It's also a little bitter, because what does this chart, assuming, I will explain the measurement of redundancy in 1 second, let's assume it's right. What does it prove? It proves that writers who have remained unread in the archive are very repetitive. Therefore, in the end, they deserved to remain. Whereas, say, someone like, we're now doing a close-up of that, why do we still read Jane Austen? Let's look here. I mean, she's, incidentally, the most informative novel, it's Pride and Prejudice. That's why she's still. So, this is, as many of you know, one of the big commonplaces. Archival writers are just better writers. Canonical writers are just better writers. And I have nothing against thinking that they're better writers, but there's something a little weird in proving something about which you have, some skeptic, you would like to question the statement. And this was the second time, because remember that early chart, the canonical writers moved in the same direction as the archive, but 15 years earlier. This is another received idea. Great writers open the way, and then mediocre writers follow. We have proved two such received ideas. And this created a lot of tension in our group, because, you know, but you have to publish your results, even when you don't like it. I mean, so no, this is, you know, the way a literary critic is trained to do research. You have, it's not that you want to be dishonest, but you pursue what's interesting of you. If you see something that doesn't, you have, it's part of the professional pact that you can ignore it. Quantitative work doesn't allow you to. You know, once you have the entire spectrum. All right. How did we measure redundancy? This is the second big problem. Mark came up, this is another case of operationalizing. You think that redundancy and information can be important features in the destiny of a text. How do you measure them? He came up with a very ingenious solution, which was looking at bigrams. Bigrams are two consecutive words. For instance, in the sentence, bigrams are two consecutive words, bigrams are is one bigram. Are two is another bigram. Two consecutive is another bigram, and so on. So a novel with 100,000 words will have 99,999 bigrams. Some of them will repeat themselves, of course. And you can measure that because, for instance, take the word of, one of the most frequent words in English. Now, the bigram of the is much more frequent than the bigram of no. And so if a writer uses of no more often, you know, he will be less predictable on the basis of. And I think the solution is that Mark gave to this problem is very elegant, is certainly extremely effective. And there was a problem, which was the overall scores were very effective. We could not look at our evidence. What does it mean? We had counted bigrams, and assuming that they were a good proxy for repetition and information, we had gotten these results. But how could we look at them? How could we study them? How could we examine which word pairs repeated themselves all the time and which did not? This is something that we'd always tried to do at the Literary Lab from the very beginning, doing measurements in order to come up with a new view of literary history, but also in such a way that it would promote a different type of engagement with the text. And so, you know, well, I'll give you an example in a few minutes, but in the case of bigrams, the engagement, see, this is the matrix, this is the basis for these things. It's, and this is just a part of the 100 most frequent bigrams in our novels. It's a matrix of about 100,000 cells. And the bigrams are all perfectly readable. And then, Lady Jane, they were, this was, through thee. But what are you going to make with them? Especially considering that this is, as you can see, a very tiny portion of the whole thing. So, this is a paradox with which literary critics are not used to coexist. It happens in other fields. It's as if we had created for ourselves a sort of homemade, homegrown version of the so-called uncertainty principle, we could measure, the more precisely we measured redundancy, the harder it became to determine where it was. The overall score was very precise, but its constituent parts, there were just too many of them. And the most frequent bigrams, their decay curves, so they were insanely similar. But there were so many of them that even very tiny differences produced very different scores. But the differences were too tiny for our usual tools. They were, and then bigrams, think of this. You never perceive, it's very unusual, maybe in some cases, but you don't perceive them as you read them. There are very few sentences or word pairs which I can call me Ishmael. It's already 3 words. Reader, I married him. It's 4. It's very difficult for a community. They go unobserved. So all right. So we found some kind of a solution, but this gets very technical. I can go into it later. But what we did in order to make sense of this result, we thought this is a great result, but we can say nothing about it. It was really very strange for me, for all of us. It was the first time that we found ourselves. There is another measure, as I said. This was a way of measuring simultaneously repetition and information. So assuming it's a simplification, but I think that the more redundant the text is, the less varied it is, and vice versa. Okay, there is a completely independent measure of lexical variety that has been devised by corpus linguistics. It's called type token ratio. Type token ratio works like this. I say the sentence, it is very nice to be here this evening. 9 words. They're all different. So 9 words, 9 tokens, but also 9 types, because they're all different from each other. Type token ratio, 9/9, 100%. Had I said, this is a nice event, this is a really nice event, this is a nice event 4, this is a really nice event 5, 9 words, but only 5 types. Type token ratio is 5/9, so is whatever, 61%. So it's a way of measuring how varied the language of a writer or of a discourse is. And we thought, okay, let's take the same text and run this other test. And basically, we thought we will find the same thing, but type token ratio, I forgot to say something important. Type token ratio is measured in snatches. And if you take the Longman grammar of written and spoken English, which we read a lot at the Literature Lab, they use 3 snatches, 100 words, 1,000 words, 10,000 words. You get slightly different results, but consistent. So we decided to go for segments of 1,000 words because they are large enough to capture enough difference between writers. Because difference increases with the number, but still short enough, we can still read 1,000 words. It's a couple of pages, so you get a quantitative result, but you also get a qualitative excerpt from a text about which you can reason with the tools of literary history. And we thought, okay, type token ratio is going to confirm this, so it's going to consolidate this very strong result, and on top of that, is going to give us ways of doing what we know how to do. This is the box plot, the box and whisker plot, which I showed earlier. As you can see, the Canon is much more informative, much more lexically varied than the archive. The next chart is the same group of texts studied with type token ratio. The Canon is less varied than the archive. Now, these are the interesting moments in the life of this type of work. Interesting because, well, first of all, you think there was a bug, so you rerun it because it seemed implausible. And then you don't know whether to be a little desperate because what you were thinking of did not happen, or happy because you found something really surprising. We have been both in different moments, and but you see, it created a really nice intellectual problem, because how can the same texts be more informative at the level of 2 words and less informative at the level of 1,000 words? I mean, what kind of mechanism is at work to reverse results in such a way? Now, again, we found some solutions to this puzzle, but and I can explain it later. We did find a solution. What I would like to end with is rather give you a sample of this way of working, and then some final reflections, and then we get to the questions period in which we can return on all these. You know, these projects are long and they're not fit for a talk. Really, I mean, it's neither a bad nor a good thing. I mean, it's just the way they are. It's a little difficult to. So, what does working on type token ratio mean for literary? Well, first of all, you know, these are the statistics. As you can see, it's consistently lower, the Canon, throughout the 19th century, and these are the highest scoring novels, that is, the ones with the most varied lexicon. You don't know anyone. You haven't heard about, I have read one novel by Jane West, but not Ringroad. Some of you may have maybe better read, I'm sure, but yeah, by and large, I don't think you've read much. And this, on the other hand, these are the ones with a relatively low lexicon. You know, all of Jane Austen is below the mean, and those are between the lowest. All of Dickens, all of George Eliot is below the mean. Adam Bede contains the most repetitive passage in the entire. This is what 1,000 word passage looks like in our program, and I'll do, forget this. You see, Adam Bede is a very strange novel to have the most repetitive passage, because it has a famous passage on Dutch painting, which is really the manifesto of poetics for Eliot, which is the manifesto for precision and variety, and it's written with enormous precision and variety. If you do the type token ratio of the first 100 words of this passage, it has a higher score than anything in any register that the Longman grammar has ever found. So the same text can run from one extreme to the other, and the other extreme is this. This is how, have I skipped? No. This is a part of that hyper-repetitive passage, and the pound sign is the sign that indicates that a word is repeated within those 1,000 words. And as you can see, I left black those that appear here for the first time, and then the asterisks indicate words that the program doesn't consider to be words. technical complications. It's not very interesting. But as you can see, it is insanely repetitive. What is this passage? This passage is Hetty's confession to Dinah of her infanticide. And I made haste out of the wood, but I could hear it crying all the while. She has left the baby. She hasn't killed the baby, but she had left it half buried in the wood. And when I got out into the fields, it was as if I was held fast. I couldn't go away, for all I wanted so to go. And I sat against a haystack to watch if anybody would come. I was very hungry and had only a bit of bread left, but I couldn't go away. Why is... Now, there are two peculiarities to this passage. The first, it has an enormous number of verbs. Verbs, inflected verb forms. And the inflected verb forms usually are a sign of action. They're often used by people who work in digital humanities as proxy for narrative. When the number of inflected verb forms rises, it's a sign that something is happening. Here, with the stroke of genius, Eliot has placed grammar and semantics in opposition. There are a lot of verbs, but nothing is happening. She wants to leave, she cannot leave. And that's why the passage is so repetitive. She cannot leave the scene of the infanticide, and she cannot leave the words with which she is describing this. Why use repetition? And this tells you repetition can be put to extremely powerful aesthetic work. It's basically, it's almost a textbook example of repetition in Freud's sense, in that famous little essay on repeating and working through, remembering, repeating and working through. She repeats because she can neither really remember nor forget. She cannot work through, she cannot assimilate this experience. That's where the repetition comes from. Repetition is a literary device that can express trauma very well. And in fact, among the most repetitive passages, there are, three confessions. The three most repetitive passages are three confessions. None is as dramatic as this. The second one is also baby changing. The third one is more banal. It's sort of a love confession. But so, what this indicates is that why do we find so many canonical authors among the repetitive ones? Because there can be a powerful aesthetic use for repetition. A very specific one, but very powerful. Other side of the problem, allow me another 3 or 4 minutes. Why are forgotten writers so good at lexical variety? What is going on? Why are all the top results by authors that are completely forgotten? Well, let me just, this is the most lexically varied passage in the English 19th century by this guy who wasn't even a novelist, and this is part of the story. He died an admiral. This is his only novel. And it is an enormously descriptive passage. This is a more specific portion of it. And as you can see, what happens here is an enormous number of nouns, adjectives, and participles. So this is how lexical, and extremely few verb forms. It's the exact opposite of Eliot's passage that I showed you. In that passage, in 75 words, there was only one adjective, hungry. Here, adjectives are 5 times as frequent as they usually are in the writing of novels. In Eliot's case, 5 times less frequent. It's usually around 6%. So, what is going on? Why are these forgotten authors so keen on lexical variety? And here, I mean, it's a bunch of various possibilities. The one on which we have fixed is this. They are so keen because it is a way of placing novelistic writing in contact with other discourses that exist around the novel. In this case, for instance, with the discourse of geography. In other instances, with the discourse of politics, of architecture, of history, of antiquarianism, and so on and so on. Type token ratio as a measure of lexical variety de facto measures the openness of novels to other discourses. Now, usually we think that this is a good thing for novels, to be open to other discourses. This is one of Bakhtin's great concepts of heteroglossia. Our findings suggest that heteroglossia may be a very dangerous wager, that opening the gates of fiction to other discourse may be a very dangerous wager, or perhaps more, in a more restrained, less general statement, that it may have been a very dangerous wager in the course of the 19th century, when in Britain the novel as a form, as a genre, was moving relatively away with engagement with external discourses, which was still very strong in the late 17th and 18th century. Pilgrim's Progress, Defoe, Pamela, Sterne himself was moving away from engagement with other discourse and much more keen on the internal logic of the novel. It's as if these writers were still looking outside of the novel. There is a concept coined by classicists. It's a concept of the fringe. A German classicist who said, you know, in ancient times there was novels proper, and the fringe. The fringe were texts that were half novels, half something else, half philosophy, half geography, half metaphysical speculation, half political education, etc., etc. Then historians of the novels have never bothered, you know, assume that the fringe had disappeared. Well, texts like this tell us the fringe has actually never disappeared. What has happened is it has lost its morphological productivity. So this is not exactly how the project ends, but this, in a sense, is how the final point I would like to make. I've been talking about Adam Bede and Arthur Montague. Perfect proxies for Canon and archive. But in the last 10 or 15 minutes, and I haven't even tried particularly hard to do so, I don't think I've ever mentioned Canon and archive, and I've mostly focused on repetition, trauma, the representation of trauma, of intensity. I could have added orality, because all powerfully repetitive passages tend to be oral passages. And in this case, instead, the novel, other discourses, and a written register. This is a very written register. So what we ended up with a second time, just as in the sociological part of the study, we started with Canon and archive, and I ended up with something very different, with the school and the market, prestige and popularity, a literary field divided into 2, 3, whatever. That's, you know, an empirical result. People could see different things in those. But Canon and archive had lost their importance, and what had become important were the forces that shaped the destiny of text. Here, less clearly, but we again had to do with the, in this case, not the sociological forces, but the textual forces, linguistic, morphological, call them as you wish, that shaped the destiny of text. And again, Canon archive became irrelevant. What was really relevant is this more impersonal devices like orality and written register, or trauma and fringe-like activities, etc. So, very generously, you said, the ambition here is to write a new type of literary history. The ambition is indeed that. The results are not that yet, not at all. There are some first few steps, and this is one of them. Thank you very much.
Very much, Franco. It was a very, very fascinating, thought-provoking talk. So much interesting new light on novels that we thought we knew, and new novels for us perhaps not to read. We allow I thought I'd take the opportunity to jump in with a question myself, because it's being slightly rude like that. But one of the things I found really interesting about your talk all the way through was your relationship to Bourdieu, and this kind of like, obviously very much your work is being set up in relation to his, and I remember from the Atlas the way that you kind of draw on him. But I like the way, this kind of critical angle that you're kind of bringing, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship, and also how you see, in relation to that, the shift towards methodological thinking rather than theory. You've become more interested in methodology, and that seems to be one of the critiques that you have of Bourdieu.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of Bourdieu, I find that chart that I showed, his chart, incredibly suggestive. There is something paradoxical. This is, unlike, say, the concept of polyphony, Bakhtin's concept of polyphony, or, political unconscious, or Orientalism. Concepts that other scholars have taken and used as tools, because concepts are also tools, they're not just tools. That chart should also be a tool, right? I mean, even more so. No one has ever done anything like that. Why? Because you don't know how to redo it, because he has given you no criteria. And so my idea was, this is a great idea which has never become an instrument of our, as it should, of our profession, because it could be extremely fertile, because it lacked any empirical foundation. Let's find an empirical foundation. I mean, this is not exactly what I meant to do. Once we've done what we've done, I realized that we have basically provided an empirical foundation for Bourdieu. We didn't set out to do that. For me, this is a combination of admiration for the idea that Bourdieu had, and I'm not even sure it's a criticism. I mean, in part, he is trying to capture the moment in which the so-called autonomous field, portion of the literary field emerges. So, art for art's sake, writers who write for other writers. Certainly, British literature, 1770 to 1830, is not that moment. One can make an argument perhaps for poetry, but certainly not for the novels. So we're dealing with a different country, with a different period, with only one genre of the novel and not the whole. So in a sense, we could come up, we have come up with exactly the opposite results, and Bourdieu could still be right. It's just that he is right without having done, without having the tools to support his side. I'm convinced that he's right, but one has to come up with the empirical evidence. So, and then it's not just that. I mean, once you come up with the empirical evidence, you find new things that Bourdieu had not imagined. You find a different configuration of the field, and so on and so on. But so that is the relationship. As for theory and methodology, theory, especially in the States, especially in the 90s, which for me was like a long winter, age of deconstruction, I found it unbearable. I found it, like a metaphysical speculation which opened the way for all forms of intellectual charlatanism. And, so I have no respect for that kind of theory. For theory, as it has long been used in other traditions, so for concepts, for laws, for the measurement of your hypothesis against reality and facts, for that I had enormous respect. But that theory did not do that, did the opposite.
Thank you very much. Question?
You said at the start that you would talk about whether digital humanities has made a difference.
Yeah.
And what's your feeling on that?
What's your feeling at the end of this talk?
I think we need more examples like that to show people how it relates to their work and why it's not just shiny toys.
Yeah, I don't think this is shiny toys, right? No. But at the same time, it's not great results. It's some results. There are a couple of interesting. I think the most interesting moment, honestly, is the Bourdieu, anti-Bourdieu moment, for which you don't really need digital humanities. A lot of patients would have basically come up with the same result. We use, things that have been done by hand before us. I've been working in this field now for almost 10 years, and 10 years ago, I would have expected that by 2015, we would have better results. Let me leave it at that. I don't think, no, not leave it at that. Let me, the usual, this is still too young. Yeah, it is young, but I would feel there are a lot of people working with extremely powerful tools. So the results should be more why are they not more? So for me, now at this point, I've entered the stage, and I will, not in this case, but in a couple of brief things that I hope to write in the next year or so, I want to reflect on this problem with a little caution, because with a little caution which arises from this fact, I'm in a very secure position, not only professionally, but also intellectually. I can play on two tables, indeed. I've also been and still be a more traditional critic. The bulk of the work done in digital humanities is done by very young scholars, very often in insecure positions, in departments with often very large components or majorities that dislike digital humanities. So I also don't want to say, oh, nothing is coming out, because it would be taken off. See, even the one person from our ranks was there. So, okay, trying to be cautious. For me, the interesting question at this point is, why don't we get better results? Because I still think that, by and large, the project of a quantitative approach to literature has merit. We must have not yet learned to ask the right questions with the tools we have. Or perhaps tools like this, I began with this analogy with the telescope. The telescope was invented basically as a toy. It was, the first exemplars were offered to this Princeling and that, to a general, maybe you can see the enemy a little earlier. Why did the telescope become the telescope? Because there had been for 100 years a controversy between the Copernican and the Ptolemaic system. All of a sudden, one astronomer realized that this could settle the controversy. And it did. We don't have, it's not that we can ask for a controversy like all the time. So these things don't happen often. But we don't, not a discipline in which something like this seems to be. I've been thinking about the ANAL, the French quantitative school. It's perhaps its masterpiece. It's Brodel's big volumes on the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II, was published in the late 40s. The conceptualization for all of this arose in Brodel's mind as a series of talks that he gave to his fellow prisoners in a German prison during World War II. So these quantitative histories with the long duration, with slow transformation, arose in the midst of the biggest sudden catastrophe of 20th century European history. It's a very different example from the Copernican, but it's a similar, it's a project that clearly draws energies from some gigantic event next to it. There is nothing comparable, I think, in our case. And instead, there is this gift, these tools that have come to us from another field. The other field has a use for these tools. We are like kids who've been given a Maserati, and we don't know what to do with it. Okay, so something like this. I'm trying to figure out why we're not getting more results. But that is my starting point. We're getting some results. There is something very adult in the fact of getting modest results. Because that's what life is about. Right? So I don't dislike that. Still, something is missing. And I would like, ideally, to correct the thing and to find a lot more things. Absent that, I would like to understand why things remain so honest.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Matt?
My question builds on the first one. And that's that you're known for two approaches in particular. Your Marxist work and then your quantitative work as well. And that's a fascinating combination because so much of the digital humanities has been criticized for almost its corporate ethos, and the proximity of your lab to Silicon Valley feeds into that. But more importantly, this idea that the digital humanities have been very light on critique, if not self-critique, then sort of critique of the cultural politics of the work being done. How do those two approaches fit together?
Yeah. And, you're right, you put your finger on it. And my last two books, one was basically my sort of path towards this, distant reading, and the other was the bourgeois. I convinced my publisher to publish them on the same day. And I wanted to make a statement, these are two pieces that don't follow. This is, authors, narcissism. That anyone would notice or bother about the fact that you've written two books and they don't form a whole. This is crazy. So, no one noticed it, and I deserved it. In retrospect, I can't believe I did it. But they don't fit. And I was hoping that, in the occasion, someone would point to the problem and maybe force me to understand better what was going on. It didn't happen, and I haven't yet done it. I haven't yet tried to reconcile the two. But certainly, work in digital humanities can produce knowledge, but this knowledge is strangely inert in terms of critique. And in my opinion, the main reason is this. You read Robinson Crusoe, Hedda Gabler, and write about it. All these texts are models of the world, are statements, are ways of shaping the world. And in taking them apart, in working out how they function, it's very easy to turn the analysis into a criticism. In a sense, the criticism is almost built into the analysis. the great generation, Roland Barthes, Umberto Eco, Jameson himself, they all did this, right? In explaining to you how a play or a film was done, generated the creature. We work with corpora, and corpora are not models of logic. Corpora are artificial constants. Right? So you can criticize the text, you can't really criticize the corpus. It doesn't make sense. Even though a corpus is much bigger than, so in theory it's more social, so to speak. But this is, for me, this is the biggest story, even bigger than the modesty of results. The incapacity to turn this into a critical engagement. So then we've used some shortcuts. The last pamphlet we published at the Lexical I did with the sociologists, it's an analysis of the language of World Bank reports. And there it's easy because, it's a World Bank, so it's a more old school exercise, so to speak. But how to turn this? It's, I simply have to confess an incapacity to solve this problem.
Just there.
Slightly following on from that question, perhaps, I was wanting to ask about whether you felt that these approaches could, sort of having talked about the openness of fiction potentially to other discourses, and whether that's positive, whether you feel it could be applied to texts that are not usually regarded as literary texts. And the text I'm particularly interested in is Capital by Karl Marx as a 19th century text, although that would also then present the question of whether you could take some of these approaches to work read in translation. And I don't know if that would complicate the question.
Yeah. Well, okay. Translations first. There has been, for me, a very negative consequence of the advent of digital humanities, to which I have contributed as much as anyone and more than most. So I'm responsible for that. I didn't realize this would happen at the beginning. Now it's impossible to miss it. Since the computer needs a consistent linguistic basis to work, it has re-provincialized the study of literature, which has become much more comparative, much more open. So we only work on English texts. People in France only on French texts. People in Spain only on Spanish texts. And it's a renationalization of literature, which is absurd. You get these new tools that in theory, and you can work with translation, but then you have to choose, the basic language. So in here, you would work translations in English, and so every other national tradition would somehow be brought in the orbit of English with the distortions. We're now trying to come up with a few comparative projects. It's an insane amount of work. Preparing corpora is complicated enough. Preparing a bilingual corpora, twice as complicated. So it's really that's really endless. As for working on non-literary texts, yes, I enormously enjoyed working on the World Bank. We may do a follow-up study. We had tried to do another study, which then didn't work out on UN documents on climate change. So we have tried. The point is you need then specialists also in these other fields. And even though there is this, all these slogans about interdisciplinary work, when it's a matter of doing work together for a couple of years, one of these projects usually takes 2 years, it's much harder to find someone from another discipline to work with. That's just the reality of things, it seems to me. So, in principle, it can be done. I think it's a bad idea for literary critics to do it. Because if some economic theorists came to me and said, I want to work on capital in translation, said, assume it was written in English, shall we work together? I want to work on Keynes and the general theory. I would probably say yes, and I would try to see what can I contribute to this enterprise. But it should not start from us. That was one of the worst aspects for me of the theory of the 80s and 90s. That all of a sudden, literary historians started talking about all sorts of things that they didn't really know much about, and we should. And no traces. We shouldn't.
I know lots of you will have questions that you'd like to ask, but I'm conscious of the time, and we've been stuck in quite a hot ball for a while. So I was just before thanking Franco again for his wonderful talk and his very generous question answering session. I want to say thanks to a few people, particularly to Ruth Arnott, who is really responsible as anyone for Franco being here. You guys met a few years ago, and so that's great. And it's a shame she can't be here, but it is appropriate that she's in Stanford. It's some sort of strange natural economy going on. Also, really want to thank the admin team who've been unbelievably helpful, and all of this stuff is them really. And also, obviously, in this department, who we are, for paying for it and everything. Thanks again to Franco. It's been a delight to meet you and to hear what you've got to say.